One of the most important things for a pilot to know how to do is to keep from running into other aircraft. And in order to do that, you need to know the federal aviation regulations that deal with that. Today on Free Pilot Training, I'm going to go into the collision avoidance regulations. And you need to know this for your check ride, but these are also going to keep you safe when you go out and fly. Probably one of the most important things to keep you from hitting other aircraft is to know who has the right of way when you meet another pilot. And while we all laugh at this meme, there's also a little bit of truth in it because things can get scary pretty quickly if you get too close to another aircraft. Now, you may remember getting your driver's license and learning who has the right of way when you come to a stop sign. And if you don't remember, that was probably me honking at you last week to let you know that it was your turn to go. Anyway, we learn these things when we're learning how to drive so we know whose turn it is, but you can't just stop in midair in an airplane. So it's even more important for us to learn who has a right of way as a pilot because it allows us to predict what the other aircraft is going to do so we don't have a midair collision. Now, as you may remember from the last lesson, Part 91 is where we find the general operating and flight rules. So you'll find a lot of what we're talking about here, and when it comes to safely operating near other aircraft, a good starting point for that is FAR 91-111. This is where you'll find some of the general rules for operating near other aircraft. Now, as you can see here, no person may operate an aircraft so close to another aircraft as to create a collision hazard. So not only is it dangerous to get super close to another aircraft, it's also illegal as well. Now there is one exception to this rule, and that's if you're flying formation. And formation flying is some of the coolest flying you'll ever do. But here in FAR 91-111, there are a couple additional rules you need to follow if you want to do that. First, you cannot operate an aircraft in formation flight except by prior arrangement with the pilot in command of each aircraft in the formation. And if you are formation flying, you cannot carry passengers for hire when you do that. Okay, now that you know that, let's get on to talking about those right-of-way rules. You'll find these in FAR 91-113, so if you're tabbing out your FAR aim, this is a good one to tab out. First, I want to point out that it doesn't matter whether you're flying under IFR or VFR. Every person operating an aircraft needs to be constantly vigilant so as to see and avoid hitting other aircraft. And just because you have the right of way, that doesn't mean you can just keep on doing what you're doing. Maybe you have the right of way over Joe Bob and his Piper Cub. But if he doesn't ever see you, he may just run right into you because he doesn't know you're there. And at that point, it doesn't matter who had the right of way, you're both dead, and it's a moot point. Alright, so first things first, aircraft in distress have the right of way over all other air traffic. And they use the word air traffic on purpose here because it doesn't matter what category of aircraft you're flying. If you're in distress, you have the right of way over everyone else. Now here's something important to keep in mind. How is anyone going to know that you're in distress if you don't tell anyone? That's why it's super important to declare an emergency if you really are in distress. Especially if you're having problems controlling the aircraft or you lost your engine or something. Yes, it's important to aviate, navigate, and then communicate, but you're not going to get priority if you don't tell ATC that you're actually having an emergency. Now, if you simply can't get the radio call out because you have a handful of airplane, it's totally fine to explain to the FAA that you were in distress after the fact. But if you have the time, get that radio call out there. It could make the difference in your situation. Okay, but what if two aircraft meet and neither one of them is in distress? Now what? Well, who has the right of way depends on the category of aircraft that you're flying. And as a general rule, if an aircraft is less maneuverable, it has the right of way. For example, a balloon has a right of way over any other category of aircraft because it's a lot harder for these guys to steer and keep themselves from hitting other aircraft. Next, we have the glider. Now, these guys can steer a little easier than the balloon, but they're limited on where they can steer because if they want to stay airborne, they need to stay in areas where there's more lift because they don't have an engine. After that, an aircraft towing or refueling another aircraft has the right of way over all other engine-driven aircraft. And this includes an airship, which is the next aircraft on our right of way list. This would be like the Goodyear blimp you sometimes see flying over football games. These are a little bit more maneuverable than the first couple aircraft that we discuss, but they're still very slow and can't move as quickly as most other aircraft. As you can see here, we clearly have 4 categories of aircraft left. But this reg makes no mention of who has the right of way over the other ones. And I personally think that's a foul because you have to go digging in the ultralight reg, which is FAR 103, to see that ultralight aircraft are required to give way to all other aircraft. So next we have airplanes and helicopters. And as far as right-of-way is concerned, helicopters and airplanes are considered equal because they're roughly the same when it comes to maneuverability. But these powered parachutes and weight-shift aircraft with engines are the lowest on the totem pole, and they must avoid everyone else. Alright, now that we know that, let's take a look at some of the situations you could get into with other aircraft. What happens if two aircraft are converging at roughly the same altitude? Who needs to give way? Well, if the aircraft are converging head-on, the aircraft category does not matter. Both aircraft should avoid hitting the other aircraft by altering their course to the right. That's pretty simple to remember, unless you're British. You shouldn't have lost the war. You could have made us alter course to the left instead, but since you didn't, we make right turns to avoid hitting other aircraft if we're approaching head-on. Anyway, what if we're converging with another aircraft and we're not approaching head-on? Well, first it depends on the category of aircraft. If I'm flying my Cessna 172, which is an airplane, and I'm converging with the Goodyear blimp, he has a right of way. So I need to avoid hitting him, and the way I do that is to pass behind him if I can. That's not always going to be possible. Climbing might be a better option in some cases, but passing behind is typically the preferred method. But what happens if I'm flying an airplane and I meet someone else flying an airplane? Who has the right of way? The right of way rule in this case is just like the one you learned when you were getting your driver's license. Whoever is on the right has the right of way. So if this airplane right here is me, this airplane is on my right, so he has the right of way. He needs to just maintain a predictable flight path, and I will alter my course to avoid hitting him. Now, as we mentioned a second ago, if I don't ever see him, that doesn't alleviate his responsibility for avoiding a dangerous situation. He may need to climb or something to keep us from hitting each other, but he does have the right of way because he is on the right. Okay, what if I'm overtaking or passing a slower aircraft? Who has the right of way? Once again, the category of aircraft does not matter, and the aircraft being overtaken has the right of way. Now, if you're passing another aircraft, you should always pass them on the right side. This one might seem a little bit more natural for my British friends, but the reason for this is because the pilot in command typically sits in the left seat, and it's a little bit easier to make sure that you have plenty of clearance when you pass the other aircraft. But even if you are flying from the right seat for some reason, you should still overtake another aircraft on the right side. This is going to make you a lot more predictable to the other pilot, and it's going to make the situation a lot safer. Now this raises an important question. How do I know if the airplane I'm meeting or converging with is headed right towards me, headed away from me, or simply converging from the left or to the right? During the day, this can be extremely difficult, but the best way to know for sure is to look for relative movement. If the aircraft seems to be moving at all, it's most likely moving to the left or to the right. You're simply converging. If the aircraft appears to be stationary, you're either catching up to them from behind or you're converging head-on. And this is another reason why we overtake another aircraft on the right, because it can be really difficult to tell whether you're converging head-on or you're overtaking them until you're right on the other aircraft. And altering your course to the right keeps you from getting beak to beak with that other aircraft. Now at night we have lights that help us tell which direction the other aircraft is going. But before we talk about how to know which direction they're going, I want to discuss aircraft lighting for a minute, because light questions are some of the most asked questions on the check ride. All the lights on your airplane are there to help other aircraft see you, so they can avoid hitting you. But which ones are required, and when are they required? You'll find most of the lighting requirements in FAR 91205 and FAR 91209. 91205 is the reg where we get our famous 8 tomato flames, required equipment list. And this is probably the most important reg to tab out in your FAR aim if you do that. There are a lot of important things to know in here, but as far as lighting is concerned, there are basically 4 different types of lighting systems you should be familiar with. First, and probably the most important, is what we call the anti-collision lighting system. This lighting system can come in a few different styles depending on when the aircraft was made, but typically you'll find one light on the tail and or one light on the belly of the aircraft. And these can be a rotating beacon or a strobe light that flashes, and they're usually red or white. And as you might have guessed, these lights flash so they can catch the attention of other pilots. Typically on older aircraft, you'll find that they have a rotating beacon, and the newer ones, they'll often have a beacon and a strobe, which is way easier to see, but it's also super distracting. Now, according to FAR 91209, anytime we're operating an aircraft that has an anti-collision light, we have to have this thing turned on. I take that to mean anytime from the time I start up the engine until the time that I shut down the engine. If I'm getting towed with the engine shut down, I would probably turn it on for that as well, but there are actually some older aircraft that were built without an anti-collision light. And if you're flying one of these, you don't have to have it turned on because you don't have one. But if it's got one, you have to use it. Now, with that in mind, according to FAR 91209, the anti-collision lights need not be lighted when the pilot in command determines that, because of operating conditions, it would be in the interest of safety to turn the lights off. Now, every CFI has his own take on this, but my personal opinion is that when I start the engine, I turn on the beacon and the strobe if the airplane has it, and I operate that way until I feel like it's unsafe. You may be asking, why would it be unsafe to operate with the anti-collision light on? I've never personally felt like I needed to turn the beacon off for any reason, but the strobe lights in some of the newer anti-collision light systems can be extremely distracting, especially if you're operating under IFR in cloudy conditions. The strobe will reflect off those clouds and it can cause you to get spatially disoriented. The strobes can also be pretty distracting to other pilots who are landing if you're holding short at the approach end and waiting for your turn to take off. And because of that, a lot of instructors will teach students to only use the strobes when they take the runway. Either way, the anti-collision light is the most important one for you to remember, because it's the one that you need to have on all the time. But what about that landing light? Do we need a landing light? Well, in 91205, in addition to our VFR day equipment requirements, we also have things that we have to have with us at night as well. To remember the nighttime stuff, I like to use the acronym FLAPS. And as you can see, the landing light is on this list, but if you read the actual reg, it says that if the aircraft is operated for hire, one electric landing light. So if you're not operating for hire, you technically don't need a landing light. But I want to ask you a question. Do you really want to land an aircraft at night without a landing light? Now, you may not even know the answer to that question, but I would encourage you to try a landing or two with your instructor with the landing lights off during your training. This will help you decide whether or not you want to fly an aircraft after dark that has a burned out landing light. It'll also give you a taste of what to expect if your landing light burns out on you for some reason. Now, what about the taxi lights? When are those required? Oddly enough, taxi lights are never required, but they're nice to have. And if your landing light is burned out, but you have taxi lights and you're not operating for hire, you can use your taxi lights to help you see when you're landing. You don't just have to have them for taxiing, even though they make it a lot easier for that as well. Last but not least, we need to have approved position lights if we're going to be flying at night. And over in 91209, it specifically says that from sunset to sunrise, we need to turn those on. If you're flying in Alaska for some reason, there are a few additional times when you need to turn those on. But everywhere else, you need to flip those puppies on right at sunset. Then leave them on until the sun comes back up. Sometimes the switch in your airplane might label these as navigation lights or nav lights. This is the same thing as position lights. Now, there are 3 physical lights in the position lighting system that need to be working and on in order to operate legally after sunset. There's a red bulb on the left wingtip, a green bulb on the right wingtip, and a white bulb at the tip of the tail. Now, on most aircraft, you can only see the red and green bulbs from the front of the aircraft or the side of the aircraft, but these lights are not visible if you're looking at the aircraft from the rear, and there's a really good reason for that. Let's say you're flying along and you see a green and a red light like this. Which way is this guy facing? And since we're on the subject, who has the right of way? Well, a good memory aid is green and red, you're dead. And while you won't be able to see the white light on the tip of the tail, the other guy could have his landing light on, and sometimes those are right in the middle of the aircraft. So if you see that, don't let that throw you off. Now here's how I remember the red and green light, and you guys let me know what you think about this method. The whole purpose in these position lights is so you can determine who has the right of way. What better way to do that than to put a stoplight on each aircraft? If I see a red light, I'll see the white tail as well, and I should also see a beacon, but the red light I'm seeing on the wingtip tells me to stop because this guy is on my right and he has the right of way. If I see a green light, I should also see the white tail light and the beacon as well, but the green light is telling me to go because I'm on his right, and that means I have the right of way. And if for some reason I only see a small white light, there should also be a beacon right here somewhere as well. But if I'm not seeing the red and green, I'm most likely seeing the rear end of this aircraft. And if I'm overtaking him, I need to move to his right like we talked about before. Alright, before we move on to another subject, there's one more thing you should know about the navigation or position lights. If your instructor has been having you operate with the nav lights turned on all the time, there's a good chance that you have one of these things right here in the place of one of the 3 normal position lights. If that's the case, this weird thing is your ADS-B out and you need to leave that on all the time. And in order to do that with this particular system, you have to leave your nav lights turned on. And you want to do that because if you have ADS-B installed on your aircraft, you're required to always keep that on no matter what type of airspace you're operating in. I've talked about ADS-B quite a bit in other episodes, so let's look at a couple more things you should know about right of way. What if we're coming in for a landing and someone is holding short of the runway? Who has the right of way? Well, according to 91-113, aircraft that are landing have the right of way over all other aircraft on the surface. But you cannot take advantage of this rule to force an aircraft off the runway surface which has already landed and is attempting to make way for an aircraft on final approach. That's why it's so important to check final before you take the runway, especially at a non-towered airfield. Not only do we want to stay alive, but that guy landing also has the right of way over us. But what if 2 aircraft are both in the air and both are approaching to land? Who has the right of way then? In this situation, the aircraft at the lower altitude has the right of way, but it shall not take advantage of this rule to cut in front of another which is on final approach to land or to overtake that aircraft. Now, if you're learning to operate a seaplane, there are a few additional right-of-way rules for those in 91-115. But the big thing to know about seaplane operations is that seaplanes need to stay as far away from other vessels on the water as possible. If for some reason a seaplane and a motorboat or other vessel meet each other on the water, technically they should follow similar rules as airplanes in the air. In a head-on situation, both should alter their course to the right. If a boat and a seaplane are crossing each other, the plane or vessel on the right has the right of way. The person on the left should pass behind the other. If you're overtaking a vessel or they're overtaking you for some crazy reason, the person being overtaken has the right of way. The reg doesn't specifically say to pass on the right, but I could see why that might not always be the best choice if there's something you might run into over there. Now take all this with a grain of salt because I bet that most people out there driving boats have no clue what the right-of-way rules are when they meet a seaplane. You may have to be the one that does all the work to avoid a collision. Now that we understand right away, let's take a look at a few more things that can help keep us from running into other pilots. Now you may not believe this since the training aircraft you're flying is relatively slow, but there are actually speed limits in the air that you need to be aware of as a private pilot. If you ever get your high performance endorsement, you could potentially break the law if you fly too fast in certain airspace. These speed limits are posted in FAR 91-117. So first things first, at 10,000 feet MSL and above, you can literally fly as fast as you want as long as you don't break the sound barrier. Now breaking the sound barrier can be a complicated topic, but at sea level on a standard day, that's about 661 knots. This is what we refer to as Mach 1. But you really don't need to know that for today's lesson because if you break the sound barrier in your Cessna, you will definitely break the wings off before you crash right into the ground. Just know that there really isn't a speed limit at 10,000 feet and above that you need to worry about. Below 10,000 feet MSL is another story though. Anytime we're below 10,000 feet in the US, you cannot exceed 250 knots indicated airspeed. Now indicated airspeed is very important here because that's what you're going to see on your airspeed indicator. So you don't have to worry about true airspeed, ground speed, or anything else. Just worry about what you see in front of you. The next speed limit you need to know about is anytime you're flying within 4 miles of the primary airport in Class Delta or Charlie airspace, if you're flying at or below 2,500 AGL. In this case, you cannot fly faster than 200 knots indicated. Now, what if I'm 4 miles from this Class Charlie airspace right here and I'm at 2,300 feet AGL? What's my speed limit? Well, we still need to be under 250 knots indicated, but the reg says within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport. So we technically don't need to slow below 200 knots indicated. But as we get closer to the airport, we need to make sure our airspeed indicator is showing below 200 knots. And don't forget, this also applies when we're within 4 miles of the primary airport in Class Delta as well. So if you're getting close to one of those two types of airspace, be sure to keep that in mind. Last but not least, we have Class Bravo airspace. And oddly enough, Class Bravo does not have a speed limit when you're actually inside the airspace. However, if you're below 10,000 feet, you still can't fly over 250 like we mentioned a second ago. And actually, if you're at 10,000 feet MSL and above, you can actually fly as fast as you want through Bravo as long as you're not breaking the sound barrier. If you ever fly in the Denver area, their class Bravo goes all the way up to 12,000 feet MSL. So there's actually a 2,000 foot sliver of airspace where you can fly as fast as you want. And I know this seems kind of backwards since the whole point in these speed limits is to keep everyone from running into each other at high airspeeds. But Class Bravo airspace is very heavily controlled, and those ATC guys have the best radar systems out there, so high airspeeds aren't really an issue for those guys. With that in mind, sometimes they may want you to slow down so you don't mess up the sequencing or spacing they have to get everyone to the runway. If this happens, they may issue you a speed restriction like this.
Mooney 2424 Victor, maintain 200 knots or slower until established on a 5-mile final.
200 knots or slower until a 5-mile final. Mooney 2424 Victor. At this point, we do have a speed limit, and now we need to follow it. Now, while there's no speed limit inside of Class Bravo, there is a speed limit you need to be aware of if you're going to be flying below the Class Bravo shelf. If you're flying down here, you need to keep your airspeed below 200 knots indicated. And if you fly through a VFR corridor which goes through the Class Bravo airspace, this 200 knot speed limit applies to you as well. Technically, you're not in Class Bravo if you're in one of these corridors, and because of that, you need to keep your airspeed below 200 knots. Now that you know your speed limits, let's take a look at another important regulation in FAR 91-121. Did you know that you're required to keep your altimeter updated throughout your flight? Now, you may have thought that the altimeter is only there to keep you from running into towers and other stuff like that. But actually, it can help you from running into other aircraft as well. Take a look at what the regulations say over in FAR 91-121. Each person operating an aircraft shall maintain the cruising altitude or flight level of that aircraft, as the case may be, by reference to an altimeter that is set. Okay, so this thing says that we must maintain a specific cruising altitude. First of all, how are we going to be able to do that without an altimeter? Well, you can't, and it's no wonder why FAR 91-205 lists the altimeter as a required piece of equipment. You need to maintain a certain cruising altitude. And we also see here that our altimeter needs to be properly set. If you're going to be flying below 18,000 feet MSL, you need to use a current altimeter setting along the route of flight within 100 nautical miles of the aircraft. Well, how do we get these current altimeter settings? If you're on flight following with ATC, or if you're on an IFR clearance, ATC should be giving you periodic updates of the current altimeter setting in your area.
Mooney 2424 Victor, fly heading 220, altimeter 29er89er. 220-29er89er, Mooney 2424 Victor.
Now that he hooked me up with the current altimeter setting, I can just spin that into my Coldsman window, and I know this thing's going to give me good data. I can also just tune the nearest AWOS, ASOS, or ATIS frequency along my route of flight. Let's tune in this frequency right here and see what the current altimeter setting is.
Russellville Municipal Airport, Russellville, Arkansas. Automated weather observation 1538 Zulu. Wind missing. Visibility 10. Sky condition scattered 5,500. Temperature 13 Celsius. Dew point 08 Celsius. Altimeter 29er84. Remarks. Density altitude 400.
Sounds like we need to spin in 29er84 into our altimeter. Too easy. Now there may be times when there's not a station within 100 miles of your aircraft along your route of flight. In that case, this line basically says to pick the closest appropriate station available. It's better to use an altimeter that's somewhat accurate than to be completely off. With that in mind, if for some reason you don't have a radio, there's not a lot you can do from the air except to use products like ForeFly or Garmin Pilot on your tablet or phone. But the preferred method is to find the field elevation at your takeoff location and to spin that into your altimeter, and this is going to give you a fairly accurate reading as long as you're flying in that local area. Once you get your instrument rating, you can start flying in Class Alpha airspace, which starts at 18,000 feet MSL. At and above 18,000 feet, everyone up there is flying on an IFR clearance. And when you're flying up there, you're required to set your altimeter at 29er92. So at and above 18,000 feet MSL, everyone up there is actually flying specific pressure altitudes. Because if you remember, when we set our altimeter at 29er92, this thing actually gives us our height above the standard datum plane. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are basically two reasons why we want to have the most up-to-date altimeter setting. First and foremost, we want to make sure that you're not getting too bored when you're out flying around. pilots should be as busy as possible. No, I'm just kidding about that. There's a good reason for this reg. First, we don't want to run into any terrain or obstacles. If we know the elevation of a tower or a mountain or something, it makes it a lot easier to know for sure that we're not going to run into this thing, especially if we're flying in the clouds. The other reason is so that we don't run into other pilots. I want you to take a look at these two aircraft that are flying directly at each other. This aircraft is flying at an indicated altitude of 4,500 feet MSL, and this aircraft is flying at an indicated altitude of 5,000 feet MSL. Let's say the current altimeter setting was 3012. These guys didn't think it was a big deal, so they didn't change their altimeters from what they had at their departure location. They may have thought they were here, but in reality, they're at the same altitude, headed right for each other. Now, I know that there are a lot of tools out there that can help keep you from running into other aircraft, and ATC can help too, but ultimately it's your responsibility as the pilot in command to see and avoid hitting other aircraft. And part of being able to do that is 1, setting the proper altimeter setting, and 2, flying the correct cruising altitude. Doing these two things will ensure you have plenty of separation between you and the other aircraft around you. Now, if you're wondering what the proper cruising altitude is, you can find the answer to that in FAR 91-159. If you're flying within 3,000 feet of the surface or 3,000 AGL and below, you can basically fly whatever altitude you feel like is safest. Now, obviously, you still need to use the appropriate pattern altitudes and stuff like that, but as a general rule, below 3,000 AGL, you can fly the altitude you need to, and this allows you to fly under Class Charlie shelves and other stuff like that. But if you fly above 3,000 AGL and you're operating under VFR, then you need to fly the appropriate cruising altitude. Now, that cruising altitude you fly is based on the magnetic course you're going to be flying. It's not actually based on your heading. As long as your GPS is displaying data in reference to magnetic north and not true north, your magnetic course would just be the track you see right here on the GPS. Okay, so what if we're flying VFR on a magnetic course of 0 to 179? That's when we'd want to make sure that we're flying our odd altitudes plus 500 feet. Then, if we're flying VFR on a mag course of 180 all the way up to 359, then we need to fly even altitudes plus 500. If you're looking for a memory aid, NEOD and SWEVEN are two of the best ones out there. If we start at north, which is exactly 0 or 360 degrees, and we move around the east side of the compass, when we're on any one of these courses here, we need to be using odd altitudes plus 500 if we're flying VFR. Once you get your instrument rating, you'll actually be flying at the odd altitude without that 500-foot addition. This gives us plenty of separation between all aircraft VFR and IFR that are flying in the opposite direction. If we start on south, which is exactly 180 degrees, and we move around the west side of the compass all the way to 359, we'll use SWEVEN, which means that if we're on a mag course of 270 and we're flying VFR, we need to choose an even altitude plus 500 feet. If I'm flying IFR, I need to choose an even altitude without the 500-foot addition. And as you can see, even if we meet an IFR aircraft traveling in the opposite direction, as long as we both have the proper altimeter set, we should not run into each other. Now, I do want to mention that when you're making a turn, you don't have to change your altitude during the turn to stay legal. 91-159 clearly states that you can just keep your altitude through the turn. Once you're done with the turn, if you need to climb or descend to get the proper cruising altitude, go ahead and do that after you're done making the turn. You'd be amazed at how many times I've been asked that question. Anyway, the whole point in this regulation is so we can be predictable, so we can avoid collisions. How predictable do you think it's going to be if you're turning and you start to climb or descend just because you're making a turn through one of these magnetic courses? Well, if I'm over here, I won't know if you're climbing or descending until I see the whites of your eyes. What's another way we can be predictable? I know every CFI here is saying talk about traffic patterns, and I want to do that, but there's way too much information to talk about in today's lesson. But when it comes to collision avoidance, there's a few things you should know about. First, check out this brief little note from 91-130. No person may take off or land an aircraft at a satellite airport within a Class C airspace area except in compliance with FAA arrival and departure traffic patterns. Think about it. In Class Charlie approaches vectoring a lot of aircraft into the airspace, and it's their responsibility to keep aircraft separated. And it's virtually impossible for them to do that if you're not flying a predictable pattern. There's actually some really good information on how they do that in the AIM in paragraph 3-2-4. The part where it talks about aircraft separation is really interesting because how much spacing they make for you depends on a few different factors. Okay, so what are some ways we can be predictable in the pattern? This isn't really a problem at a towered airfield because we just need to do what we're told, but if we want to be predictable at class golf at a non-towered airfield, one way we can do that is to make left turns like it tells us to do in 91-126. Of course, there are lots of runways out there that have right patterns instead, and we could easily find that information on the VFR sectional like you see here. The chart supplement is a good place to get that information too, but a lot of times there'll even be visual markings on the airport to let us know which way we need to make our turns. Now, there are a handful of airports out there that has special rules and procedures. You'll find a majority of these up in Alaska, and their chart supplement has a lot of good information. So if you're going to be flying up there, you really need to take a good look at their chart supplement if you want to be predictable. Part 93 has a few additional things for the super busy airports across the country as well. But a good place to start for every place you go fly is the chart supplement. So being predictable and flying the proper cruising altitude are two things you can do to keep from crashing into other aircraft. But another thing you can do is to do what ATC tells you to do. Let's take a look at FAR 91-123. As you can see, this reg deals with clearances and instructions. And when it comes to these, there's a couple things in here you really need to be aware of. First, when an ATC clearance has been obtained, no pilot in command may deviate from that clearance unless an amended clearance is obtained, an emergency exists, or the deviation is in response to a traffic alert and collision avoidance system resolution advisory. Now, I'll explain what this traffic alert and resolution advisory thing is here in a minute, but notice here that when it comes to a clearance, if you're ever uncertain, you need to immediately request clarification. ATC controllers use standard terminology to make sure you know exactly what they're talking about, but they can sometimes make mistakes too and use non-standard terminology that might be confusing. And this brings up an important question. What happens when a pilot makes a mistake? Well, the pilot dies. But what happens when ATC makes a mistake? That's right, the pilot still dies. And while we all chuckle at my dark sense of humor, there's quite a bit of truth in that. So you should always clarify if there's a question about a clearance ATC has given you. Now, notice here that except in an emergency, no person may operate an aircraft contrary to an ATC instruction in an area in which air traffic control is exercised. And this brings up an important conversation. First of all, you can see here that we have two different things we can get from ATC: clearances and instructions. Clearances give you authorization to do certain things. When you're at a towered airfield, you have to be cleared to land or cleared for takeoff. If you want to go into Class Bravo airspace, you need to be cleared into the Class Bravo. And these clearances need to be followed no matter what airspace you're in. And you also need to read those clearances back as closely as possible to the controller so there's no uncertainty whatsoever. But with that in mind, there's something important you need to keep in mind about clearances. When ATC gives you a clearance, that's basically clearance to proceed. It does not alleviate your responsibility of not running into other people, and it also doesn't necessarily give you priority over other aircraft. As you continue to fly, one of the most common examples of this is when two aircraft get cleared to land at the same time.
Skyhawk 3148 X-ray, cleared to land 36.
Clear to land 36, Skyhawk 3148 X-ray.
Cherokee 7348 Juliet, traffic to follow. It's a Cessna 172 on a 1 mile final.
Traffic in sight, Cherokee 7348 Juliet.
Cherokee 7348 Juliet, number 2, cleared to land 36.
Number 2, cleared to land 36, Cherokee 7348 Juliet. Now notice, the tower told us that there's a Cessna 172 on a 1 mile final. Once we told him that we had the traffic in sight, he told us that we were number 2 and he cleared us to land. But the Cessna has priority over us because he's number 1. Just because you have a clearance, that doesn't give you priority over other aircraft. In addition to that, a clearance doesn't necessarily give you separation from other aircraft. Yes, ATC sometimes provides separation from other aircraft for you in certain airspace, but once you have that other aircraft in sight, ATC doesn't actually have to provide any separation in some cases. That's your responsibility even before you see that other traffic, to make sure you're not going to hit someone else. That's why you should always be scanning the area, even if you are in controlled airspace. Now, there are some clearances that you won't always hear the words cleared to do this or cleared to do that. Taxi clearances are a good example of this. After you land, as you probably already know, you need to taxi clear the runway, and that means taxiing past the VFR hold line. And in case you didn't know, you should not automatically switch to ground after landing at a field with a control tower. Sometimes the tower will control taxi clearances that cross a runway, but if they want you to switch, you'll often hear a radio call like this.
Cherokee 7348 Juliet, taxi left on Kilo, ground point 9er, wind off.
Left on Kilo, ground point 9er, wind off. Cherokee 7348 Juliet. Now, as I've said before, it's not uncommon to get the famous ground point 9er or ground point 7 or whatever. A majority of the ground frequencies are 121 point something, so if you get this, just know that ground is on 121.9. They're just trying to sound as cool as possible, and I don't want to sound dumb, so I'm going to follow suit.
Tower, any chance I could get the actual ground frequency?
Anyway, so we switched to ground, then my radio call would sound something like this.
Ground, Cherokee 7348 Juliet, clear of 36 at Kilo, request taxi 36 for closed traffic.
Cherokee 7348 Juliet, taxi to 36 via Alpha, hold short 36.
36 via Alpha, hold short 36. Cherokee 7348 Juliet.
Okay, so taxi to 36 via Alpha, hold short of 36 is my clearance. According to 91-123, we are required to follow this clearance now. But what if I change my mind because I all of a sudden need to take a massive, and this FBO over here has a great bathroom. Well, there are basically 3 ways to get out of a clearance. And the first way is to get an amended clearance. All you have to do is ask for it. Now, they won't always give it to you, but if they don't, there's usually a really good reason for it. And if you don't get an amended clearance, you need to follow the original clearance to the letter. Let's ask ground for an amended clearance.
Ground, Cherokee 7348 Juliet. We've had a slight change of plans. I need a taxi to the South General Aviation parking and shut down for a bit.
48 Juliet, roger. Taxi to the South General Aviation ramp via Alpha.
Taxi via Alpha, 48 Juliet.
And 48 Juliet, what's the reasoning for this amended clearance?
I'd rather not share the details, but I'm having a slight physiological episode. 48 Juliet.
Roger, 48 Juliet.
Another way we can legally deviate from an ATC clearance is during an emergency. Let's say my brakes go out on me as I'm taxiing to the runway. I probably don't want to taxi onto the runway even if I am having an emergency. Someone could potentially land right on top of me. I may just want to kill the engine and coast to a stop. I wasn't cleared to stop on the taxiway, but I'd say that might be a pretty decent option, don't you? Now, it would be nice to let ground know what you're doing and get that amended clearance, but sometimes you just don't have the time to get the radio call out there. Another way you can legally deviate from an ATC clearance is to avoid hitting other aircraft. Let's say I've been cleared for takeoff on runway 36 here, and right before I turn to take the runway, I look up and I see someone about to land right on top of me. I look straight ahead and I see that I can push the power up and taxi onto 4 left right before he hits me, and no one's on final for that runway. Should I do it? Of course I should. It's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. But if you didn't do anything wrong, there's a chance that you might not even need to do paperwork for that deviation. Just let ATC know as soon as possible if you do something like this.
Tower 48 Juliet, just taxied onto 4 left to avoid that landing aircraft.
Copy that, 48 Juliet. That aircraft just landed on the wrong runway. If you feel good to continue, you are now clear for takeoff, 4 left. Fly runway heading, maintained at or below 2000.
Runway heading at or below 2000, 4 left, clear for takeoff, 48 Juliet.
As you can see, that aircraft that landed on the wrong runway deviated from ATC's clearance. Not only did he break the law, but he almost caused a collision. That's why it's so important to follow these clearances. If you need something different than what you were given, you need to remember that these are the only 3 good reasons to deviate from a clearance that they give you. Now, as I mentioned a second ago, in addition to clearances, we could also just receive instructions from ATC. These might not necessarily be a clearance, but you still need to follow those instructions. As you can see here in 91-123, no person may operate contrary to an ATC instruction in an area in which air traffic control is exercised. A good example of this is when you're trying to enter Class Charlie airspace and you make this radio call.
Low Rock approach, Cherokee 7348 Juliet, 15 nautical miles to the northwest at 3,500, inbound with Echo.
Cherokee 7348 Juliet, remain clear of the Class Charlie airspace.
Roger, I'll stay clear of the Charlie, 7348 Juliet.
Now, this isn't a clearance, but it is an instruction, and we cannot operate contrary to that instruction. No, we don't have to have a clearance to enter Class Charlie, but this is one way they could keep you out of the airspace if they wanted. But what happens if you lose radio comms with ATC? How do you get instructions or an ATC clearance in that situation? If you're operating under VFR, the best starting place for this information is in the AIM in Section 4, in paragraph 6-4-1. And if you're operating under IFR, you should read that and then check out FAR 91-185. But basically, the first step is to squawk 7600 on your transponder. Observe the flow of traffic into the airfield and enter the pattern in an appropriate spot, then follow the light gun signals from the tower. But the question is, can I enter Class Charlie airspace without two-way radio comms if my radio isn't working? That's a tricky question because this note in the AIM basically says land as soon as practicable, but then it says pilots retain the prerogative of exercising their best judgment and are not required to land at an unauthorized airport at an airport unsuitable for the type of aircraft flown or to land only minutes short of their intended destination. But if you read the requirements for entering Class Charlie airspace in FAR 91-130, each person must establish two-way radio communications with the ATC facility providing air traffic services prior to entering that airspace and thereafter maintain those communications while within that airspace. Now, it goes on later to say that you can call their office and ask for a deviation, but it can be pretty difficult to do that from an aircraft. So basically, if you haven't established two-way radio comms before you lose your radio, you need to just pick a small airport outside the airspace to land at. Now, if a greater emergency exists, you could always squawk 7700 to let them know you're an emergency, and at that point you can land wherever you think is the safest place to land. But if you lose radios before you enter Class Charlie, and because of that you can't establish two-way radio communications with the ATC, you just need to land at the closest non-towered airport and figure out things from there. With that in mind, it is possible to land at one of these locations, call the approach facility up on the phone, and ask if you can get permission to enter the airspace without comms. If they allow it, they'll give you some kind of clearance and probably some instructions on how they want you to enter the airspace. Then they'll tell you to watch for light gun signals from the tower. In addition to that, you may also get a squawk code, or they may just have you squawk 7600. It all depends on the approach facility. Okay, let's say you had two-way radio comms with ATC and you lost it right after entering the airspace. You've tried to reach them several times and they're not answering. So you squawk 7600 to let them know you've lost comms and now you're inbound for the runway. Now you should be looking for light gun signals coming from the tower. Alternating green and red lights always mean to exercise extreme caution. Most of the time, this will be one of the first signals you see when you're headed towards the pattern. Now you should be trying to figure out the best way to enter, but if you ever see flashing red, that means the airport is unsafe and you really need to find somewhere else to land. If for some reason you see a steady red light, that just means that you should give way and continue circling. Just find a spot and make some gentle turns outside the pattern and wait until you get another signal from the tower. Flashing green lights let you know to return for landing, but you're not clear to land yet. When you get this one, that would be a good opportunity to enter the pattern and to get ready to land. You can let them know you got the signal by rocking your wings during the day or flashing your landing lights at night. Then, when you get the steady green light from the tower, you're cleared to land. Once you land and you're safely on the ground, the tower should give you the flashing red light. This is just telling you to taxi clear the runway. Once you're clear of the runway, a flashing green light lets you know that you're cleared to taxi. And if you see a steady red, stop the aircraft and wait for the flashing green light. From now on, you're playing the adult version of red light, green light. Now, on the ground, there could be a time when you need to take off from a controlled airport without a working radio, maybe to get it fixed or something. Once again, you need to call the appropriate facility and get permission with them before you get in the plane. So we should call the tower in this case since we're taking off from a towered airfield. In this situation, there may be a few additional light gun signals you need to know. To get things going, start up your engine as you normally would, then point the nose of your aircraft towards the tower, and wait for the flashing green light, and that just lets you know that you're cleared to taxi. Once again, just watch the tower and stop if you get the red light. At some point, you could also get a flashing white light while you're taxiing. If you get this one, that just means to return to the starting point on the airfield, wherever that was. Maybe the tower decided that you needed to sign some kind of paperwork before they let you depart the field without a radio, and they wanted you to taxi back. There could be a million reasons for them having you taxi back to your starting point, but if you don't get the flashing white light, just continue to taxi and hold short of the runway until you get the steady green light from the tower, and this just lets you know that you're cleared for takeoff. Here's a look at all the light gun signals you should be aware of. You'll find this chart in paragraph 4-3-13 of the AIM. This is a good one to read over, and it would also be a good idea to print this guy out and put it somewhere readily available in case you need it. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is somewhat of a complicated topic, but there are some aircraft systems out there that can tell you to deviate from an ATC clearance. And on some of these systems, it's totally legal to do so. As you may remember, in some types of airspace, we need to have a transponder and ADS be out. Not only do these pieces of equipment tell ATC where we are, but they also show your position to other aircraft so they can keep from hitting you. If you have an iPad with ForeFlight, as long as it's connected to the internet or an ADS-B puck, this can give you some great situational awareness on the traffic around you. But this does not take the place of spotting the other aircraft with your actual eyeballs. And you should never advise ATC that you have the traffic in sight if you see them on your iPad but not with your actual eyes. With that in mind, there are a few advanced systems out there that can provide a pilot with more detail on the traffic in the area. But there is only one system out there that can provide you with information that can allow you to deviate from an ATC clearance or instruction. This system is called Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System, or TCAS. Now, there are actually two types of TCAS. There's TCAS 1 and TCAS 2. Both systems interrogate the transponders from other aircraft and take their ADS-B information, if it's available, to determine whether or not that aircraft is going to be a collision hazard. Both versions display other traffic in the area, but in addition to that, when another aircraft gets too close, you'll also get something called a traffic advisory that shows up on the screen as a yellow circle and gives this audible alert.
Traffic.
Now, if you remember from earlier, 91123 actually says we can deviate from an ATC clearance if it's in response to a traffic alert and collision avoidance system resolution advisory. Now, I know the wording's kind of confusing here, but what this is actually saying is you can deviate with a TCAS resolution advisory, not a traffic alert. The AIM actually clarifies this just a little bit better. It says when a TA occurs, attempt to establish visual contact with the traffic, but do not deviate from an assigned clearance based only on TA information. Okay, so how should we treat one of these traffic advisories or traffic alerts? Here's kind of what I do. As soon as you see the traffic advisory, you should immediately start looking for that traffic. If you really do think that traffic is going to be an issue, ATC is most likely going to help you by giving you a vector. But I would probably not deviate from an ATC clearance unless you're 100% sure that this guy's going to hit you. You also need to be 100% sure on what you need to do to avoid the collision, and a traffic alert really doesn't give you that information. With that in mind, TCAS 2 can issue something called a resolution advisory, which actually does tell you what to do if the system thinks that you're going to hit that other aircraft. Usually, you'll get the traffic alert first, then you'll get a resolution advisory that'll help you avoid the collision.
Traffic. Climb. Increase climb.
If you get this advisory, you can and should follow these instructions to the letter because your life probably depends on it. In either case, as soon as you know the traffic is no longer a factor, you should always notify ATC as soon as possible, especially if you deviated from a clearance.
Little Rock approach, Cherokee 7348 Juliet. We just climbed for a resolution advisory. Looks like the traffic is no factor now.
Roger 48 Juliet, sorry about that. His transponder just popped up seconds before you maneuvered. He must have been having issues with his transponder.
Now, I know most Cherokees aren't going to have TCAS, but systems like this are getting more and more common, and it's very likely you could fly an aircraft that has it with your PPL. And like I said, we should always follow the clearances and instructions from ATC, but if we want to be good pilots, we also need to use a little bit of common sense. If a dangerous situation is developing, don't just follow ATC blindly. I've flown in mountainous terrain before and had ATC try to vector me right into the side of a mountain. They actually tried to do it multiple times. Obviously, I'm not going to kill myself just because I'm trying to follow their instructions. But as soon as I got the heading, I knew it wasn't going to work, so I spoke up.
Cherokee 7348 Juliet, turn left heading 320.
Approach Cherokee 7348 Juliet. I'm going to maintain this heading for 2 more miles and I'll make that turn. I've got some terrain in the way here.
Roger 48 Juliet, just advise me when you're on the 320 heading.
48 Juliet.
Now, if you ever do deviate from an ATC clearance, even if it is an emergency, there's always the chance that the controller could have you give them a call.
48 Juliet, after landing, go ahead and give me a call at this number. Do you have a pen where you could write this down?
I can't write anything down right now. I'm too busy flying.
I'm just kidding, don't do that. Take the number and call them once you're on the ground. Sometimes they may just need a little bit more information on why you did what you did. Maybe the controller made a mistake and they don't want it to happen again. It might not always be your fault. There's also a chance that they could request a written report from you, and if that happens, you have 48 hours to submit that to their office. Even if you had an emergency and you didn't break any rules, you could still get asked for a written report, and the reason for this is because you get priority over all other aircraft when you declare an emergency, and they need to have that information for their records. And once again, if you're asked for a written report, you have 48 hours to submit that report. And he'll tell you exactly where to send it once it's done. I hope you learned something from today's video. In my next video, we're going to be talking about some of the regulations when it comes to safety in the airplane. When I'm done with that video, I'll put it right here. In the meantime, check this video out. You're going to like it. I'll see you over there. See ya.
Bro, you're not going to believe this. I just bought it free pilot training. I'm going to keep on watching.